was working on a sociological history of the rise of globalization studies. And while I was working on that and teaching on that, I just came on an article that had been written by Raewyn Cannell, so the Australian sociologist, that was more or less saying that, well, globalization theory was northern theory. And I must say that the reading of this article completely changed my way of seeing things. I think I have read this in like 1994, so more than 10 years ago. And ever since, I have been trying to understand more about, that whole big continent that is non-Western social science. I am saying social science because in most of the countries and most of the areas that are concerned, the very distinction between sociology and anthropology is not really relevant. And for a French scholar, it is very odd, because in France, sociology and anthropology are really two very separate disciplines. And so it took me times to read, to try and understand what had been going on in those kind of concealed areas of the world as far as the history of the social sciences were concerned. So this is how I will try to develop my argumentation, my presentation today. That is to see how I came to understand the very history of sociology, that is an attempt at writing a different history of sociology as a way to decolonize sociology as a whole. Most of the time, this is not the way decolonizing sociology is understood. It's usually understood as, well, only, well, quote unquote, only changing curricula, changing the canon. But I think that it can start with something a little bit different, which is also not only taking the present into consideration, but taking the past into consideration. So this is what I will try to present today, and in the form of what kind of connection can we draw between decentering the history of sociology and decolonizing sociology. So the first slide of my the second slide of my presentation is about the issue of what it means to decenter. And decentering is something that is quite complicated. It's not something easy at all, because decentering, and you certainly know it because you have certainly been taught to it. But in France, in Germany, in Great Britain, in the United States, this is nothing obvious at all. So I will also present the view from, I wouldn't say my side, but at least from the position where I'm teaching and researching. What is the problem? What is the difficulty to decenter? Because first, decentering, and I think that is it's true in the Western world, but it's also true in the non-Western world. It means being able to name one center or several centers. And it is this first step is certainly the most complicated one, because precisely the very process of creating an epistemic hegemony means suppressing the very idea of a center. It usually means understanding the pragmatic center, the de facto center or centers, as just being the historical centers and nothing more, as though they were the logical ones and not something that had to do with a specific history. So naming, just being able to name the center, or the centers is important. The second thing, is everything okay?
Sorry, I think there was someone who mic was not muted.
Oh, okay. No problem.
Sorry about that.
Okay. No problem. So the consequence of that is, once you have been able to name a center or several centers, then it means acknowledging the existence of one periphery or several peripheries. Why do I insist on several peripheries? Because there is not, usually there's not one center and one periphery. Because those are, and I will come to that in a few seconds. I think the most interesting way to understand this is to understand center and periphery as being fractal, which means that if you consider, I don't know, let's say Western Europe as being a center. Well, in this center, not all the countries are really core countries. There are also peripheral countries in this center. So there are peripheries in the center, but there are also cores in the periphery. And it could be quite easy to show, for instance, that in the case of sociology or social science, nowadays, South Africa belongs to a global periphery, but is also a core or a center in Africa. And it is important to take this into consideration because it allows to have a more complicated vision of all that. What does that mean? It means that the center periphery pattern is not a very simple one. It is something that has to be taken into consideration for every kind of situation. And so, as I said, it means that there is that kind of fractality of the center and the periphery. And we could say that, for instance, let's take the example of a country like Sweden. We could say, well, okay, Sweden is a Western country, so Sweden is in the core. Well, if you look at Swedish sociology, well, Swedish sociology is not a core sociology. Swedish sociology is in the periphery of Western Europe sociology. So this is also important to pay attention to that. And we could, of course, repeat the same kind of understanding and study for every continent, Latin America or Asia, and trying to see, for instance, what's the importance of Indian sociology or Chinese sociology as compared to some other sociologies. I now turn to the third slide. What is the problem with the mainstream or classical history of sociology? Well, there are four main problems that I have identified. The first one, which bears a very complicated name, but that's easy to understand, is what I call a restricted synecdoche, which only means that most of the time when you open a book that is devoted to or entitled History of Sociology, in that book, you will only find names and books coming from like 5 or 6 different countries in the world. Most of the time, Germany, the United States, Great Britain, France, Italy. And that limitation of the history of sociology to those 5 or 6 countries is considered to be the whole history of sociology. So the synecdoche is the fact of taking a part of the actual history of sociology to make it the whole history of sociology. And that is one of the biggest problems in the history of sociology, even today, not only in the 1930s or in the 1970s, even today. The second flaw is what I call heroic history, which means that we usually consider that the development of the discipline is revolving around a number of names of people like Durkheim, Weber, Marx, Parsons, Bourdieu, and so on. Whereas this is not the way it works. People as such, individuals, do not make the history of a discipline. The third flaw is a specific trend which considers that when you study the history of sociology, you have to understand it as being a national history of sociology. So there is a history of sociology in France, in Brazil, and there are not so many histories of sociology in Brazil, but well, let's say in Germany, in France, in the United States, and so on. And even when some non-Western cases are taken into consideration, for instance, there has been recent studies of sociology in South Africa. Even in those cases, it is limited to the country, as though there were absolutely no connections to other disciplinary configurations in other countries, as though there were no international connections. And so we have this idea of the country as being the container of sociology. And the fourth flow is this flow of disciplinary history. What does that mean? It is this idea that, well, there is a time when sociology becomes a discipline. It becomes institutionalized. And then from this, there is a strict distinction that is made between a pre-disciplinary period and a disciplinary period. And in fact, this distinction doesn't hold historically, because it is only seen from the present onto the past. That is, it is anachronical. Because of course, those people who say, I don't know, say that they are sociologists in the late 19th century, in Japan, for instance, because I will talk about Japan in a few minutes. Those people who say they are sociologists in Japan in the late 19th century, they don't think that they are pre-disciplinary sociologists. They just say that they are sociologists. So the very act of distinguishing between pre-disciplinary and disciplinary is something that has been written by some sociologists writing about the history of sociology during the 20th century. So we have to take that into consideration if we want to understand those mainstream flaws of the classical history of sociology. I hope all this is clear. I will just try with the fourth slide to make it maybe clearer. So this is an excerpt figure that is taken from a French book, which I hope shows what I have been talking about. So the meaning of the title of the page is The Beginning of Sociology. And so we see that, well, there are 3 different countries: France, Germany, Great Britain. And you can see those lines, those descending lines that insist on the fact that all that is national. And throughout the pages, what you have are names: Comte, Marx, Tocqueville, Spencer, blah, blah. And then there are the United States, and then there is Italy, as though all that was completely linear. And you can notice that there is absolutely no interconnection between the different countries. I think that, and then I turn to my fifth slide. Of course, if you have questions, you can ask them just after the presentation. And I think that all this makes it possible to rethink the history of sociology and to think about the benefits that a transnational and non-hegemonic history of sociology could be like. So let me try to explain what I mean. And I hope this is not too complicated in such a short time to do that. I believe that a transnational history of sociology presents the advantage to re-historicize and to re-specialize the linkages, the circulations, the translations, and the networks. Because actually, if we want to go a little bit deeper into the history of sociology, I mean, in the very mid-19th century, the very word sociology was coined in France. This is a fact. But the spread of the word is something that has not really been taken into consideration. How peculiar, how weird it might seem. We do not have, even now, that is almost 2 centuries after this phenomenon, we do not have a history of the spread of the very word sociology, of its translations. And of course, when we do that, but I won't have time to do it, now, we can see a lot of things as far as translation is concerned, as far as who is reading what Auguste Comte had been writing, who is using it, but not only using it, but also in which way. Is it a positive use? Is that a negative use? And all this we do not have. Also, and I will be very short on that, it denationalizes the framework, because then we have a more connected landscape of networks. And it allows this transnational history of sociology, it allows to encompass global relations of power. Because when knowledge is circulating, it's never circulating in a neutral way. Most of the time, it is circulating from either one more hegemonic power to a less hegemonic power, or the other way around, and so on. And we have to take that into, we have to pay attention to this. And it means that the history of the discipline, it's not only an internal history. It's not only what is going on within the discipline. It also has to do with what is going on outside the discipline. And I will tell more about that when we come to talk about the colonial and the coloniality part of it. Quite quickly, I would like to take 3 examples of how the classical history of sociology is completely dismissing parts of the history of sociology. Let's have a look at Japan. You have on the left side, on the 6th slide, you have the cover of the first issue of the Shakaizashi journal, which means sociological journal. And this journal dates back to 1897. That is at a time when the American Journal of Sociology did not exist. And this journal is never cited in any history of sociology. Japan is certainly one of the very first countries in which sociology was institutionalized. You have on the right some clues about that. The first professor of sociology was in 1876, and he was an American who had been hired by the Japanese government to teach sociology at the Tokyo Imperial University. But the first Japanese professor was in 1893. The first professional association in 1986, and the first journal, as I said, in 1897. Even those facts are not known. If we turn to Latin America, so the next slide, the diffusion of positivism, that is we could say this set of ideas that had been organized by Auguste Comte, but that also been remade, re-articulated by other people like Herbert Spencer, for instance. Positivism was diffused to Latin America from the 1860s onwards. And rather quickly, we can find instances of positivism giving birth to some facts, to some crystallizations of sociology. For instance, when Rafael Villavicencio, he was a physician originally, and he became acquainted to positivism, and he was appointed as the chair of the universal history at the Central University of Caracas in Venezuela in 1875. And his inaugural lecture, so in 1875, in Caracas, was full of sociology, because Venezuela was looking for sociology as a science to make a society at that time. So sociology was not per se an academic discipline. It was much more something like a political practice, but also a set of ideas. And so we have different kind of examples. One other point that is hardly known is, for instance, the foundation of the Instituto de Ciencias Sociales in Caracas in 1877, or the fact that Eugenio Maria de Hostos, who was a Puerto Rican scholar, he founded a normal school in Santiago de los Caballeros in 1881, and that his Tratado de Sociología, that is his treatise of sociology, was published in 1904, but that it was composed of the lectures that he gave in 1883. Of course, within a different trajectory or historical trajectory, but I think it is important to insist on that, there is per se no direct proof of something like sociology or social science by Africans before the 20th century, even if, of course, we could, and some people do that, we could refer to Jomo Kenyatta, or we could refer to Sol Plaatje as being founders or pioneers of African social science. But if we think, at least from the 1960s onwards, if we think of such people like Akintola Akiwowo, Archie Mapedje, or Bernard Magubane, that is, people who have worked in the 1970s on indigenous sociology, or on the issues of crisis in anthropology and sociology. And sorry for the typo in sociology. We can only notice that they are not taken into consideration in the history of sociology, whereas their work has been influenced, but it has been influenced in some, I would say, gray zones, or at least zones that have remained gray, that is, not paid attention to by Western scholars. So these were just three examples of what we can do, and how we can provide examples of earlier sociology than what is usually expected. If I now turn to the ninth slide and try to understand how it would be possible to provincialize epistemology. I insist on this because usually epistemology is considered as something that is, well, just there. Epistemology cannot be provincialized because it is understood as being universal, but it's not true. Methodology, theory, epistemology, they are always created somewhere by people who have a positionality. That is, they are writing something that has to do with their mental structures. So provincializing epistemology means to pay attention to the colonizer's vision of the world. The creation of the social sciences were intimately related to colonialism. And the universalization of the epistemological structures and ideas was also linked to that. That is, with that idea that epistemology is universal and that something like a relative or specific epistemology, well, just cannot exist. If it does exist, then it's not science anymore. So we could understand in this way, we could understand the diffusion of Western science as a cognitive imposition of universalism. And we can understand this spread of Western science as a form of academic colonialism and as what Jack Goody, for instance, described as the theft of history, which means that we need to be careful at distinguishing political decolonization, that is the creation of newly independent states, and epistemic decolonization. Because epistemic decolonization is something that is much slower than political decolonization, and it might even be something that never occurs. We need to push it. We need to move to get this epistemic decolonization, and not only the epistemic decolonization of the non-Western world, but also the epistemic decolonization of the Western world. Because the Western world is also still in that kind of epistemic coloniality that is in the idea that they have the truth and that there's nothing to be done. This idea of epistemic injustice, I would just like to present it with two very quick examples that come from very recent data that I could get. So that's the 10th slide, and this has to do with a data about the manuscript submissions to the journal International Sociology. And it's not in 2004, I'm sorry, it's in 2024, so last year. And last year, you can perfectly see the number of, so on the left table, you can see the number of manuscript submissions that were done. And China, or Chinese scholars, submitted 51 manuscripts. And now just have a look on the right at the number of manuscripts that were accepted. Only 4 of them were accepted. That is, the ratio is 8%. As far as South Africa is concerned, the ratio is 25%. When you have a look at the ratio of acceptance, you can perfectly see that the global South countries have a very low ratio of acceptance as compared to the global North countries. If we turn in the next slides to the manuscript submissions to Current Sociology, that is the second journal of the International Sociological Association, well, we almost have the same kind of data. If you have a look, that's the table on the extreme right of the slide. If you have a look at South Africa, there were 4 papers that were submitted and none were accepted. But if you have a look at United Kingdom and the United States, the ratio is 63 and 42. We could say that, well, this has to do with the quality of the papers. It would be rather easy to say that. I have a different interpretation, even if it's hard to prove it. My interpretation is that I would say that most of the papers submitted by Chinese scholars, South African scholars, Argentinian scholars are considered not to comply to the standard that is the one requested by those journals, which is a different thing, because a standard is a norm that is being decided by a journal, by the editors of the journal, and I'm pretty sure that there is something to do with the kind of references that are used in the papers that were rejected. And I would be interested, even if I don't have proofs so far, no smoking gun, I would be interested in knowing what is exactly the kind of argumentation that is used to refuse those papers. And now, quite quickly, because I'm running out of time. So with the 12th slide, I would like to start insisting, but I have also already been doing so, on the fact that the history of sociology is actually a narrative of Western domination. It's a narrative of Western domination insofar as it is characterized by its naturality. That is, well, it is so. It's characterized by some form of non-historicity or a limited historicity that has to do with the Western countries only. So there is a Western evolution or Western development, but the non-Western areas of the world are not paid attention to. And when there are changes in either the core, that is the main topics in sociology, or in the canon, that is the main authors in sociology, when there are changes, those changes always occur within the framework of Western sociology. Let me give you two very quick examples. There has been in the late 40 years a progressive, a gradual inclusion of more women sociologists into the canon of sociology. But if you look at who are those women, well, they are British, they are German, or they are American. If you have a look at for instance, the Black people who were included into the canon, where are they coming from? They are coming from the US, and only from the US, and not from, I don't know, sub-Saharan Africa or from Northern Africa. So the expansion of the canon stays within what is admitted, which is Western. Just to give one example, if I turn to the 13th slide, if you look at the evolution that was demonstrated by Philip Coram in his recent book on what he calls elite sociologists, if you have a look at the first, well, the top 5 sociologists in the 1970s and in the 2010s, well, you can see that Durkheim and Weber are still here, even in the 2010s. That is 100 years after they passed away. And if you have a look at the most frequently listed authors in Canadian sociological theory syllabi, which is the graph on the top right of the slide, you can see very easily that the top 3 is Marx, Weber, and Durkheim in the 2010s. So it gives us an idea of what the canon is. It does not have to do with who are the most influent people and scholars at the time being, but it has to do with who are considered to be the milestones of the disciplines, which means that if we want to change something, we need to challenge the history. And this will be the subject of my last two slides. What could we try to do? How can we decolonize the history of sociology? I think what we have to do is to write a more inclusive history. And this is not paying lip service. It is only looking at the very spreading of sociology as a word, and also the spreading of the sociological practice in very different regions of the world, even very early, that is in the second half of the 19th century. So it means reconsidering the chronology of the worldwide expansion of sociology. Even if you have a look at those people and who have been very careful and very cautious into the considering the work that had been done outside the West. I'm thinking of someone like Immanuel Wallerstein. If you read Immanuel Wallerstein, he writes that, well, the internationalization of sociology only begins in the post-World War II period. Well, that's not true. It is absolutely not true. It began way before. So here we have to do with a mythology that we need to just shatter, that we need to dismiss. Because if we keep that, then we do not understand what has been going on. And we need to study how the canons and the counter canons have been produced. Because this is not, there's no fatality in that. We are not doomed by the canon. If we study how it has been produced, we can perfectly understand that it is an historical construction. And it means that including the history of counter-hegemonic voices and movements into the history of sociology is something that is absolutely crucial, including Akiwowo, including Mafeje, including Magubane, including other people coming from different parts of Africa, Latin America, Asia, is a way not only to understand the past, it's also a way to understand the present. And so with my last slide, what I would like to say is that, of course, we, and that's a collective we. It's not a we that would only concern non-Western countries, not at all. To me, it's a global we. Western, non-Western, and I would even say Western or non-Western is not important. We have to change something. And what we have to change is the curricula and the textbooks. And we certainly have to dissociate history of sociology courses with sociological theory courses, because they are not the same at all. But it would mean certainly teaching or updating instructors into a different history of sociology. It means extending the scope of authors and concepts. It also means reflecting upon concepts. Is it possible to write about a Brazilian slum or barrio with the concept of city as it was developed by Burgers and Park? Certainly not, because this concept was completely linked to Chicago. And it cannot just be transplanted to another part of the world. It means that the contemporary issues of epistemic hegemony and epistemic injustice have to become relevant topics in international conferences. This is not a taboo. This is something that has to become completely crucial. And of course, it is not possible if we do not include in our reflection a state of sociology in the world nowadays. Where is sociology practiced, taught, written? How many sociologists? Certainly the country in which there are the most sociologists in the world is China. And yet we do not know anything or very few things about the state of sociology in China and how many sociologists and all that kind of stuff. So we really need to move on, but not it's moving on having that form. Well, that's my belief, at least. It's moving on with that form of anchoring into the past. I mean, the actual past, not the mythological past of the discipline. I will stop on this. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Let's give a round of applause. Thank you, Stephanie, for a very interesting sort of presentation. I think for us as South African sociology, it's coming at a quite very interesting sort of like time. I think you would remember in the last 10 years, there's been quite a very sort of strong push from student movements pushing for the decolonization of sociology and the decolonization of the university at large. So I think you are coming up with some very, very interesting sort of like, in a way, thought-provoking, some things that we sort of like, in a way, would be sort of like, in a way, helpful for to many of us here, especially when it comes to the South African sociology. But let me open up, before I open up, we also look at our history as South Africa with sociology. Has been quite very sort of like paradoxical when you look at it. We sort of like, in a way, the hegemonic voices, there's been some sort of like contestation between different types of voices, where you find that there has been sort of like, in a way, at some point, hegemonic voices that were sort of like, in a way, fighting for the maintenance of the status quo, and at the same time, counter-hegemonic voices. But what is interesting in this, you would find that, like I'll give, for example, within South African sociology, you would find that what the architecture of apartheid seems to was one of the sort of like professors in sociology at Stellenbosch. So you would find that within this sort of like hegemonic voices, the sociology has been found to be on either side as within sort of like trying to articulate the voices of progressive movement, and at the same time also trying to accept the views of the hegemonic sort of like, in a way, not so progressive sort of like, in a way, the taking into the context of other. So sociology, the history of sociology, especially in South African context, has been quite very contested in a way that sociology has been involved both in terms of trying to articulate the voices of the poor and the masses, but at the same time, it has also been found to be part of sort of like, in a way, the voices that's trying to maintain to the status quo in terms of domination of the not so progressive voices. So I think very important sort of like, in a way, your take. Let me open up for questions, comments from colleagues, then we can have a conversation. I'll give Stephen a chance to respond. Maybe I will take about three to four questions, comments from colleagues, and then I will give a chance to Stephen to respond. So colleagues, questions, comments? Colleagues, please, our students, may you please ask questions, comments? I would want to start with our students. I see Let me start with Christopher, then I will give Dr. Sibarache, will come after the student. So Christopher, you can go ahead.
No, thank you very much, Doc, and thank you very much, Professor Stephanie, for a well-grounded presentation. I think it was quite interesting, but just my question in terms of your slide when you speak about the sub-Saharan Africa, in terms of the scholar named Majev, when you were mentioning this is part of the scholars that were sort of disregarded in terms of the dispensation of sociology. So I just want to understand if part of your study tried to give us an inclusive, some sort of a contribution in terms of how then do we try to include those types of sociology in the sociological dispensation. Thank you, Doc.
Okay, then can I give you two questions? Then you
yeah, sure, no problem.
Okay, Doc Gugrume, you can go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's a very welcome and timely talk that you have given, Prof, on decolonizing the history of sociology. And I'm particularly interested in especially some of the silenced and marginalized scholars outside the canon. I think you talked about Magubane, Akiwowo, Mafeje, and I think we can also add Du Bois there. And I think recently there have been attempts to incorporate Du Bois in the canon, but I think there are quite a lot of other scholars that have also been overlooked. Haldun is another example as well. So I just wanted to hear from you in terms of you teaching in Europe, in France, which I think is a very strong influence of sociological history in terms of the acceptability of rethinking the canon and also the pushback. In what ways are some of these sidelined scholars, for instance, being accepted in thinking with this new history of sociology? And then I think the other question that I would also throw in is we have a lot of interesting concepts around epistemic disobedience, around border thinking, in terms of how you seek to rethink the history of sociology. Would you want to locate it within some of these concepts around epistemic disobedience or border thinking? Do you find this concept productive as a way of thinking and rethinking the history of sociology? Thank you, Prof.
Well, thank you for those two set of questions and three interesting, really interesting questions. Thank you very much for that. I would certainly start with the fact of the when you said, I mean, with the last speaker said that, well, we could also include Du Bois in the set of people I have mentioned coming from South Africa. Of course, Du Bois can be mentioned, but as I said during my presentation, the gradual inclusion of Du Bois within sociology and within the sociological canon has, at least to me, been made within the framework of Western sociology. That is, Du Bois was not included as an African sociologist. He was included as an African American sociologist, which is completely different, because the very idea is that Du Bois was the kind of inventor of fieldwork sociology in the US with the creation of the Atlanta Research Center in the late 19th century, at a time when in Chicago, the research in sociology was much more something like an armchair sociology and not a fieldwork sociology. So this is why I do not include Du Bois here, because I think that it belongs, as far as the canon is concerned, he belongs to another set of people. Of course, I could have included other sub-Saharan or African scholars into this, but well, it would have taken me many slides to do so, because there were many people who were very important about that. And the first question about how can we kind of re-include or include people like Akiwowo, Magubane, Mafeje, but we could also think of Kandawire and so on. How can we include them? I think there are two ways to do that. I think the first way is to recognize the role they have played in the contestation of Eurocentrism. That's the first thing, because what is quite striking is that challenges to Eurocentrism is never considered as a relevant topic in sociology or in the social sciences, whereas it should be. And when in 1986, Akiwowo writes about the importance of the Yoruba oral poetry and the possibility of an indigenous sociology from Yoruba oral poetry, there were many debates, even in the West. For instance, in 1990, when Margaret Archer, who was the president of the International Sociological at the time, when she delivered her presidential address to the ISA in Madrid in 1990, she contested Akiwowo's proposal. So we could say that he was included, but he was included as someone who should not be included, if you see what I mean. So he was dismissed and not really taken into consideration. Mafeje, it's about this, and Magubane, it's about the same. If you look at Magubane's article, and that's the early 1970s, I think it's 1971, if my memory is correct, about crisis in sociology, that's a very early, it's more than 50 years ago. And yet, I hardly see that article cited, whereas it's completely fundamental to understand what was going on, to understand epistemic hegemony, and to understand epistemic injustice as well. Mafeje not only was the victim of racial hegemony in South Africa, but also epistemic hegemony. And when he wrote about the necessity to change the anthropological method in order to have, for instance, the lake people of Africa studied by scholars coming from those very communities, he was proposing something new. Whether we like it or not, that's not the point. He proposed a very innovative way to consider anthropology. If you look today, and that was in the 1980s, if you look today or in the last 25 years at the changes in anthropology, for instance, when you look at the books by Linda Tuhiwai Smith about methods in anthropology, it's exactly the same kind of thing had been said by Mafeje 25 years before. But Mafeje is nowhere, neither in anthropology, in histories of anthropology, nor in histories of sociology. And I think it is important to have them in, not because it is important to have African people per se, but because it is important to have important voices. That is, voices who try to modify things, change things, change the equilibrium or the balance, which was of course an unbalance at that time, and still is an unbalance at that time. And so this is why I am trying to change at my, well, very small level. And so the first question was about, okay, but if I remember well, it was also about how do you teach? There was a question about how do you teach that? Well, this is precisely what I teach. I have a master's course that is about world sociologies, in which I teach what has been done in Latin American sociology, Asian sociology, North African sociology, Sub-Saharan sociology, to tell students about the fact that, well, sociology is not only about Weber, Durkheim, Marx, Parsons, Bourdieu, Giddens, and whatever. And how striking it might be, students are just fascinated. When I tell them about sociology in South Africa, for instance, the fact that, as it was mentioned in the very first place, the fact that there were two different sociological associations existing in South Africa until 1994, I mean, they just cannot believe their eyes. First, they didn't know there could be sociologists in South Africa because they have never been told. So when you are 21, 22, how can you imagine this? So my goal by trying to, well, to have that project is to show them, to broaden their horizon and to show them what does exist. And from this, to try and change their opinion, not their opinion, sorry, to try and change their point of view about what Western sociology is, or at least to understand that there is something like Western sociology that exists, but there is also something which is not Western sociology, and that it is worth reading, even if, and one has to insist on that, and sorry, I'll shut my mouth. It is that those people like Magubane is not translated into French, for instance. Akiwowo is hardly translated into French. I think there is one article in French. Mafeje, I think there is only one article in French. So it's not easy to teach them because there is a lack of translation as well. And for instance, French students hardly read English. So the combination of those two also makes it complicated to push for a better knowledge of those to me just incredible scholars. And I have tried. I'm trying to prepare an anthology with text translated from those scholars.
Okay, thank you for that, Stephanie. Let me open the next round. Colleagues, question. I saw there was a hand. You can go ahead. There was a hand from, I can't see the hand now. Sorry. You can go ahead. There was a hand. Someone had a hand. Or else, can we have other questions, comments, colleagues? Comments, questions? Okay, I do have got. I don't know whether I just wanted some point of clarity here. While we wait for other questions, there could be some questions coming. So maybe sure. I just wanted to thank you very much for this. In a way, the question around language, because when you look at it, like in our case here with South African sociology, we do have got French-speaking countries, like especially the continent. There's very little in terms of interaction within sociology in the continent. You will find that. We do have got next to us here, Portuguese in Mozambique. There is sociology there that is happening in Mozambique. There's also Angola and in other. So there's very little because of the the problem of language, and which sort of like, in a way, may also relate, especially when you look at the history of sociology, what you've highlighted about Chinese sociology and Japanese sort of like sociology. So I just wanted to find out how can we sort of, because you have highlighted the need to provincialize the epistemology, but at the same time, there's also the need to internationalize. Sort of like, how can we sort of like create a balance while it's trying to internationalize sociology in terms of the history of sociology, but at the same time also provincializing the epistemology?
Well, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking. There are two things. First, I think that there is a need to for sociological scholars in, I would say, each continent or region or sub-regions, whatever, to try and have a look at what is going on elsewhere. I really do believe in that. It had been tried, for instance, by the Egyptian economist Samir Amin in the 1970s. And from this time onwards, it's not really been tried. And I think that this should be tried more, because there are quite a number of social scientists in Latin America and in Asia nowadays who could perfectly be talking to you, sub-Saharan social scientists, and exchanging upon those ideas of, well, Western hegemony, indigenization. I have not talked about indigenization, but of course it belongs to the conversation. Universalism as well, because, well, what does that mean? How can we move towards some kind of universalism that would not be a regional or parochial universalism? And I really do think that there should be some international conferences that would make it possible for scholars from the different regions to exchange about what they're doing. I've had the chance to discuss with people from Latin America, from Eastern Asia. And for instance, in Eastern Asia, they are completely trying to rewrite a sociological theory that could be, relevant within the framework of Confucianism. So, of course, this could seem to be completely at odds with what you might have in mind, for instance. But is it really so? I'm not completely sure, and I would be interested in the kind of conversation that it would that it could entail and that it could convey, because I think this is the kind of conversation that we need from people, from one to another. For instance, if you want to have a look at what has been going on in Latin America, there has been 2 years ago, there's been a book published at Sage, which is called Key Texts in Latin American Sociology. And there is one that has been released in January 2025, that is Key Text in Japanese Sociology. And those are translations. And I think that we could imagine also some forms of books in which there would be translations of texts coming from different parts of the world, but talking to one another. All this is possible, and of course, it would be. I think it would be fantastic to have a book, an anthology, a collection of texts that would be about the African main texts in, I don't know, sociology, epistemology of the social sciences, or whatever. I think it is very important, and it does not completely exists. There are parts of that in various species, but there is not one single book about that. And I think it would completely deserve a handbook. For instance, that is something that could be widely diffused, that could be widely commented as well. And I think we need that. We need more communication between one another, and we also need to be able to read one another much more than we actually do now. I think so.
Okay, colleagues. Can I open the last chance for? Thank you, Prof, for very interesting sort of like response. Let me give the last chance, colleagues. I think there was someone whose hand was up.
I think there's some questions in the chat there, Doc.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, we've got some questions in the chat. Let me open it. Okay, I was not paying attention to that. It's quite a lot, actually. There could be quite a lot. I think the first one is, what is it? The first one.
Chongo, yes. Okay, yes, Chongo. So, oh yes, there are many. Sorry.
Yeah. Then they says here, Prof, can you also speak about the exclusion of women in the history of sociology, both globally and South Africa?
Yes, of course, I can. I think it is. Well, there are two things. On the whole, it seems to me, at least as far as my knowledge is concerned, it seems to me that, as it was the case in many areas of science in the 19th century, there were few women. But it doesn't mean that there were no women, especially because there were, especially in some countries, a great commitment of women into a form of social science that was not considered at that time to be the greatest level of science. And for instance, in the United States, there were many women who were in what was called the social service, if you like. That is women who were committed to trying and understand the way the poor people could be helped, for instance, in the US or in Chicago. This is an important point. There were also women who were deeply committed into the women's rights. And those two groups of women were almost completely dismissed for quite a long time. I mean, they were not really taken into consideration until the mid 1970s or so. And I'm only talking about global North women, because there were also women from France, I mean, Black women, for instance, writing in the 1920s and 1930s, who were quite committed, but also quite aware of what was going on. And for instance, American social science, who were in link with, were in touch with people like Du Bois at that time, and even their role has not been recognized yet. I mean, there is another exclusion, which is which is a double exclusion, which is the exclusion of those women who came from the global South. There were not many, as far as I know, of course, but those who existed were almost completely forgotten. I have discovered, for instance, the existence of a group of Chinese women sociologists writing in the 1930s, and they have been completely forgotten. I have also learned quite recently that Franz Boas, the German-American anthropologist, pushed his female informants to earn social science degrees in the United States, but there is no real study of those people, and that would be very important to know that, because as I said in the presentation, now we have, I would say, a broader canon, but this broader canon is still almost entirely Western, and we need to know more about that. I'm also thinking of something, because there is an absolutely fantastic female Nigerian sociologist who is studying the Yorubas, and she's almost completely unknown. She's Nigerian, but she's teaching in the US, and she's almost completely unknown in outside the US. I do not know how much she's known in Africa, but that would be interesting to know. I'm trying to have her translated into French, because I think it is absolutely crucial that we have those kind of voices, that we can have access to that. I could see in one of the questions that there was something about Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and this is to me a very important scholar. And I have translated an article of him about the sword and the pen. And I mean, Ngugi wa Thiong'o was one of the very first who started saying in the late 1970s, early 1980s, that the issue of language was an absolutely crucial issue, and he was caught between two things, which is okay, but as is writing in Kikuyu, as you know, and his problem was, okay, I want to write in Kikuyu, but if I write in Kikuyu, I can only be read by very few people, which means I have to be translated into another language. And here is the ultimate tension, I would say, which is kind of the same kind of tension that we have with, I don't know, Chinese or Japanese sociologists, for instance. What choice can they do? If they want to insist on the fact that their quote unquote sociology is important, then they want it in their own language. But if they write it in their own language only, then it's only read in their own country. So how can you change things if you're only read in your own country? This is one of the things we need to think about and to try to find solutions. Maybe to have, I don't know, bilingual books. For instance, I think it is very important. I have not answered to the. I'm sorry, I just remember it now. I've not answered the question about epistemic disobedience and border thinking. That was a very good question. I think that the importation of the decoloniality pattern into sub-Saharan Africa is very important. It's very important because it's an appropriation. It is not a transplantation per se. It is more what I would consider as an appropriation, and I think it is completely relevant. And the fact that there are more and more works about that issue of decoloniality in Africa is, to me, the signal that something is going on. I'm thinking, for instance, of the works of Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatsheni, and I think that he's is one of the loudspeakers also in the Western world, because he teaches in Switzerland, of what is going on in Africa. And it is important to have brokers, to have people who can speak, I would not say on behalf of, but at least who can convey information, and to talk about what is going on. And I think that, well, yes, border thinking, epistemic disobedience, coloniality, decoloniality can be very important concepts, and I think that they are way too much refused in the West, especially in France. I would say, and to me that's a pity, because we refuse them on the ground that they are political concepts, and that the people who have used them, like Mignolo and Aníbal Quijano and Enrique Dussel, Ramon Grossvogel, they are mere activists. But I think that precisely here lies one of the things we have to insist on. That is that science doesn't have to be neutral. Because if science is neutral, then you can never change the balance. If you want to change the balance, we need to be political.
We've got a few hands. If I can give a chance to.
Sure. Sorry, I'm talking too much.
Sorry. Shane, I see your hand is up. Shane, you can go ahead. Shane and Eddie, in that order.
Yo, Eddie. I think Eddie should go first, though.
Okay, it's fine. Eddie, are you ready?
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me there?
Yes,
yeah, I do.
You can go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks just for the wonderful presentation. It's kind of a discussion, I think, that's been going on for the least 20 years, even in South Africa, and it's been a theme of the major sociological conferences for many years, but it just appears that there is some kind of inertia, and we never get down to doing the work that you're suggesting we do, or proposing we do, and somehow there is an overwhelming sense of the crisis, I think, in the world on probably all levels, and its impact on the intelligentsia in South Africa in general. My question really resolves around the fact that Karl Marx wasn't a sociologist, but was claimed as one, and formed part of now the historical legacy of sociology. My question that prevails around the specific contributions of non-academics to theory and knowledge building. And in particular, for example, I have two names in South Africa which I've never seen as well. I.B. Tabata was part of the Unity movement, one of the great intellectuals in the early 20th century. And of course, our second president's father, Govan Mbeki, as well, wrote a wonderful book on the Peasants' Revolt and so on. Now, the question is about the kinds of standards set about who can be accepted and who cannot be accepted into the science or the social sciences as an issue, because my view is if we reject the legacy of these thinkers, because a lot of the thinking happened outside of our universities, precisely because we had, for them in the early generations, the older generations, there was a highly restrictive access to universities. And thus we had the kind of dominance of white intellectuals in the landscape, even in the academic landscape. But in the non-academic landscape, where most of us resided, first and foremost, and then secondly into the academia, their works were more, in a sense, profound, in a sense that their theories and ideas also shaped how we acted across in our places of work, in our activism, and so on, more so than the narrow sense of academia itself. So yeah, that's just the one key question that I'm raising. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
let's give Shane, then you can respond. Can we have Shane's question, comment?
Yeah. Okay.
Hello, Stephanie. Hello, everybody else.
Hello.
Hey, thank you for that question. I have a long question. It's gonna take some time, and I've been listening to you guys. I just want to say, Stephanie, I like the eloquence. I like it when you use crystallization, decolonization. I think it's the accent. But I want to apologize because I'm not that good at English. But I wanted to add on something here. Because I noted that you mentioned these critical thinkers, the main ones, and that their knowledge is all around and being referenced all around the world. I just want to raise the or bring up the point that there's a reason for why these critical thinkers are renowned around the world and being referenced in the sociological studies, because they were part of the generation just after colonization. And the whole world is colonized. You see, I just wanted to mention that. Really, my question that I want to raise to you, and it's because every time I hear colonization and decolonization, I note that decolonization has to do with centralization. So my question to you is, the significance of colonization took part in the world, and that is now why that knowledge is everywhere. Now, as a way to decolonize, I don't think it's a good idea to just have our writers and our historians come into the fold, because they're already coming from a standpoint of colonization. But here, the idea that I'm trying to raise with you, or the question that I'm trying to ask you, since colonization was such a big part of the sociological knowledge, and we reference that, and we can see that that is the only way, that centralization, maybe not centralization according to country, France versus England versus all these, they were all centralized in the idea of taking over the world, going over over the seas and extracting those resources. So my question to you is, specifically the sociologists here, the South African ones, the Zimbabwean ones, the Namibian ones, and Botswana ones. Don't you think, what do you think of the idea of South Africa, these countries that I just mentioned, centralizing and then colonizing the world? The question what I'm asking is, why do sociological, what's your viewpoint on the idea of South African sociological knowledge and institutions actively practicing the colonization or centralization of South Africa? This is now within the historical sociology, the world, the geopolitical setting, and everything. Can we, instead of including older or newer scholars within the same story, instead of doing that, why don't you think it's better to rather actively practice, and then centralize amongst ourselves?
I see.
Okay.
Okay, I might start with the last question. Thank you for asking that. That's a complicated one. If I take some major points from your question, what I understand or what I pick up from those is the idea of centralizing, the idea of practicing, and the idea of among ourselves. If I'm correct, I would say these are the three big poles of your question. And to that, as far as South Africa is concerned, because you're talking about South Africa, I would say, well, of course, because there is nothing that prevents the possibility of social scientists, and I use this term social scientists precisely to say, to refer to something that is bigger, to the bigger than the academy per se. Of course, you can do whatever you like, and nothing could prevent you to, well, work sociologically on South Africa and among yourselves. There's nothing that prevents that. The only thing is that I would say doing this has one drawback, which is that if every country does the same, then it means that we would have as many sociologies as many countries in the world. And then what we would have is what I call a sea of sociological islands that have a consistence in themselves, but that do not have connections. I know that, and you are perfectly right, and I completely support what you've said. Of course, not only colonialism per se, but also the colonizers' vision of the world, which has been sustained even after colonization or after decolonization, has been a centralization. That is, has been a way to universalize and to try to standardize the visions and, for instance, the academic or the scientific practices. But still, does that have a sound? Does that have a sense? Is that meaningful if people from working on society in South Africa cannot talk to people who work on society in, I don't know, Angola, Mozambique, or Argentina and India? I would tend to say that there's a meaning in that. And this meaning is about comparison, comparing. And comparing means having some form of a common language, at least a shared language, a vernacular language. That is the sociological language. Of course, this sociological language does not have to be the colonizers or the former colonizers' language. Not at all. But you will have noticed that most of the time it still is. And we need to change that. But if we want to change that, we need to work on that. Because the relevance of social situations cannot be described by concepts that have been designed I mean, 20,000 kilometers away in a different social, historical, political, intellectual situation, which means that there must be some form of a discussion. So instead of a sea of sociological islands, I would claim for a sociological archipelago. That is the possibility for sociologists or people, whoever they are, who know their country, the social situations the best, to be able to communicate about what is going on in their country and to share, to exchange, to connect with other people working more or less on the same kind of topics in different areas in the world. And I think that this is a form, maybe it's utopian, but I think it would be some way to try and modify the epistemic hegemony that is still going on, because it would give the very people working on society in their own country a bigger legitimacy in showing what they know, instead of always having to justify what they are doing in the words or in the language of the former colonizer. So I would say that this would certainly be the way to go. I perfectly understand the idea, and I have discussed that with one of your South African colleague, Jimmy Oadesina, who's a friend of mine. I've discussed this many times with him, and he said, well, we are Africans, so please let us do our own way. And I understand this. But on the other hand, he is going to international conferences and presenting things about South Africa. So it's not only his own way or the African way, it's maybe something that is, okay, we could say remolded or redone or done differently, but it is also shared. And I think that this is precisely what we, this is what we need. I'm sorry if this does not completely answer your question. That's the best I can do right now. As for the other one, I agree with you about the necessity to include people who are not from the academy, and I think this is the more so because, and I hope that it was more or less or somewhat present in my presentation. I think this has to do with also the way we write the history of sociology, because we disciplinarize sociology. And that is, we consider that it only exists as soon as it is institutionalized. And there are a number of studies that shows that there were people thinking about society in different countries of the world, and who were thinking about societies without being sociologists or even claiming that they were sociologists. For instance, the Filipino writer Jose Rizal in the mid-19th century was such a writer, and I have mentioned Jomo Kenyatta. I have mentioned Sol Plaatje as well. And these people have written crucial things about social life in Africa, in Asia, and some in Latin America. I'm thinking of Paulo Freire. For instance, they were not academics. So we also need to have a broader vision of the discipline per se. That is, there is a history of the discipline, and there is the history of what I call the movement of ideas, which is not exactly the same thing. In the chat, there was a question, and I think it has to do with the first of the last questions. The question was about the fact that the people I mentioned from sub-Saharan Africa were not sociologists but anthropologists. Well, no. Akintola Akiwo was a sociologist. He claimed himself to be a sociologist as such. Archie Mafeje had been trained in anthropology because he earned his doctorate in Great Britain at a time when there was no doctorate in sociology. And he did not really make any difference between sociology and anthropology, because precisely the strict difference between sociology and anthropology is a Western difference. It was made and accepted to make the difference between studying modern societies, that is sociology, and studying pre-modern societies, that is anthropology. But in many countries of the world, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and even after that, there was no real difference between both. In India, the two main people teaching sociology in India in the mid 20th century, that is Gurye and Srinivas, they were teaching sociology, but they had a doctorate in anthropology because they had been trained in Great Britain. So I know that this distinction between the disciplines has a history. I know that it has a Western feature. This is the reason why I keep a form of I would say, border thinking, if you like, or at least a blur, because it is not very important as such to know if Mafeje was an anthropologist or a sociologist. It also depends on the text they write. When Magubane writes Sociology in Crisis in 1971, he writes sociology. But what he says about sociology could be said about other things. When Talal Assad, the Palestinian anthropologist, writes about anthropology and the colonial encounter in the early 1970s, he writes about the anthropological discipline. But of course, it does not make him, it doesn't box him once and for all into the discipline. And there were some people who have been navigating from history to sociology or to anthropology. And so I'm not taking people out of their disciplines, or that's not, I hope that's not what I've been doing. I've just been using the text that those scholars have written, and in which they were contesting Eurocentrism in the social sciences as such. I hope I have answered.
Okay, thanks for that, Prof. I'm not sure if there's still anyone with any burning before we come to the close. I think I would like to thank Stephen for a very sort of thought-provoking sort of presentation, which is coming timely for us here, because that conversation has been ongoing for some time, especially.
I know.
Yeah.
And if anyone has,
there's a question. Go ahead, CM.
Yeah.
Yes. Go ahead.
Absolutely. Yeah. Is there a question?
Yes.
Okay.
There is. You can go ahead, please. CM.
Thank you for the presentation. And I just want us to move from the topic of colonization and decolonizing for a minute. Part of your presentation, you mentioned mainstream flaws of sociology. Can you please go back to that? Because I didn't quite get that. The mainstream flaws.
Which part can you which slide?
I do not know which slide it was, but as the professor can take over.
I cannot hear you very well, actually.
I think you're speaking too close to the mic. It's also even from this side. Can you try to say that again? I beg your pardon. If you can raise the question again, comment.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can. It's a bit better.
Is it better if I type it? I just wanted Professor to go back to the mainstream flows, because you mentioned that there are evident mainstream flows in sociology. So I just wanted to go back to that, not mentioning decolonization, even though that was the topic we were supposed to dwell in today. I just wanted to touch on the mainstream flows that you indicated about sociology.
Oh, so if I understand you correctly, you're saying that I have not touched upon decolonization of sociology, right?
Not what I said. We just had a debate about that. So what I'm saying is we move from the debate and talk about the influence of sociology.
Yeah. Yes, I think we need to have that. The problem is that most of the time, you know, even if you use that very phrase, like decolonizing sociology, you are almost instantly considered as someone who is an activist. You are not understood as a scholar who is doing a scientific or academic work. You are much more seen as someone who is trying to mess around and to create problems. And there are not many people who accept that. And there are also not many people who want to go into that debate. Why? One of the reasons, and especially one of the reasons they claim for not engaging into that kind of debate, is that, well, okay, you're an activist. You're not speaking on on scientific ground. So we are not on the same level, and I do not want to engage into that debate. But this is a smoke screen, because that's not the point. The real point is that most people, especially Western social scientists, do not have the arguments to engage into that debate. One of the most interesting things is that they do not have the knowledge. They do not know about Latin American sociology, Arab sociology, Asian sociology, African sociology. So they do not have anything that can really sustain their argumentation, except the fact that they have the canon, that they have this mainstream narrative of the history of sociology. If you start talking by telling, okay, but well, look at this, look at that, look at those people, look at that kind of debate, and so on, they never answer, because they don't work on that. This is one of the reasons why I mentioned in one of the last slides that it would be absolutely crucial to make the very issue of decolonizing sociology one of the main topics of today, whereas it is not. When we have a look, today, one of the very few places in which there are such debates are either some conferences taking place in the Global South, or some more or less philosophical, epistemological conferences. But otherwise, if you look, for instance, at what is going on in the ISA, so the International Sociological Association, there are very few debates about that, whereas it could be, and I would even say it should be, the place where it would have to be taken into consideration precisely. And this has to do with the fact that there is some form of a, I would not say taboo per se, but there is a non-acceptation of the relevance of that topic. And when there is an acceptation of the fact that, well, we should know more about regional sociologies or the diversity of sociological traditions, then it's only a collection of national countries and never a more subtle and comprehensive discussion about the issues at stake. That is universalism, relativism.
Okay, you said there was a taboo. Which part of sociology is taboo?
No, I don't think it's a taboo as such. I said that I said taboo, but I'm not sure it's the right word. It's not really a taboo. I think it is it is some form of a refusal, which is not exactly the same thing, because taboo is rather unconscious. It's, well, understood as being unconscious. I think it's more of a refusal because it is quite complicated to find people to engage with such debates as such. When you look at the people, when you look at the scholars who have been writing on decolonizing sociology recently, what is the most striking is that most of the time what they have done is trying to show how sociology has been Eurocentric. Well, okay, that's good. That's a nice point, and I think it is important. But they have never tried to show how sociology has been much broader than it has been considered so far, which means that their decolonizing task is kind of limited to a critique of mainstream sociology. What I'm trying to do is different. I'm not trying to say, well, Western sociology is something awful and it's been so Eurocentric. It has been Eurocentric, that's for sure, and it is still hegemonic and still having much impact on sociology in other places of the world. But I'm not saying that the only thing we can do is trying to make sociology less Eurocentric. I think that we need to rebuild the foundations. And rebuild the foundations does not mean finding other foundations. It means just looking at the past foundations of sociology in the various countries, because they have been existed, and there are traditions in various countries, in Brazil, in Peru, and of course these trajectories have not been the same in all the regions of the world. In Latin America, it has started in the late 19th century. In Asia, it has started in the late 19th century. But in other countries, for instance, in North Africa, it has only really started, I mean, in the sense of a sociology by Moroccan, Algerian, Tunisian sociologists. It has only started in the 1950s and 60s. In sub-Saharan Africa, it has only really started from the 1950s or so. So the pace has not been the same everywhere, and this is what we need to take into consideration. But for that, we also need to have a picture, a big picture, a broad picture of what sociology is now. And even that, we don't really have it. So I mean, decolonizing to me, it's not a motto.
As a sub-Saharan African woman, what are the chances that if I were to write a book or if I were to voice myself right now on an international spectrum, what are the chances that I would be listened to or I would be given an ear? Just randomly, not saying my name or not being introduced. What are the odds that a sub-Saharan African woman would be listened to?
I've not completely heard your question. I'm sorry. Can you try to repeat it again?
Okay, Prof. Maybe let me give the maybe try to type so that because there's a bit of a muffling sound it's very difficult even from my side. If you can try to type, I will try to pose a question to Prof. while we wait for Decolonized to type her question so that he'll be able to answer it. So my question, this is my last one, Prof. I think listening to your presentation and the current debate that is ongoing, and also looking at the history of sociology, that contrast that you have the history of sociology as a discipline that developed to understand modern society versus anthropology to study the primordial sort of like in a way societies. You would find that a lot of the voices that has been calling for the decolonization of sociology has been actually people who are coming outside what I would call the mainstream sort of like sociology. So there's often a tendency to say, like, for example, you have cited Gacheni Ndlovu, then sort of like he could easily be dismissed by saying, actually what he's writing about is not sociology. So can we really talk about decolonizing sociology, or maybe we need to take a transdisciplinary sort of like approach because when looking at sort of like this question around decolonization, can it sort of like is it really possible to talk about decolonizing sociology without taking a very sort of like disciplinary approach? And at the same time, is it possible to salvage sort of like given the history and what the current sort of like status in terms of this Western sort of like domination or hegemony in as far as sociology is concerned? Can we really sort of like, is it possible to salvage sociology, or maybe sociology needs to be destroyed and then come up with a new sort of like I don't know whatever it looks, so sort of like a new sort of like ways in terms of maybe how we can understand society, which sort of like would allow the other voices that are in many cases at the moment which are silenced within sociology. Thank you.
It's quite hard to answer if sociology has to be kept as such, if it has to be transformed, if it has to be suppressed and replaced, because this is not the kind of process that one person or even a group of persons can really decide. These are big processes and long processes. If you look even throughout the 19th century, which is certainly the century during which what we nowadays call academic disciplines were created, there were various changes in names of the disciplines, and there were many more names that were proposed than names that were kept. So shall we keep it? Will it be kept? I cannot answer that. And honestly, I don't really care, because I'm not really sure that's the most important most important thing as such. What I really believe in, and I mean, this discussion we've been having for like 2 hours is to me the confirmation of various different conversations I've been having on different continents as well. That is that the most important thing is the discussion. And because through the discussion, it is through the debate, it is possible to have some of the most important issues rising, and from this rise of issues and discussion of those issues, of course, because it's not only about debating, it's once you have debated, what do you do with the outcome of the debates? And I think that it's trying to, well, answer those issues. It doesn't mean solving them, but at least trying to propose an answer. But this answer also has to be collective. That is, it's not one person deciding for the others. It is something that is a dialogue. I really believe in dialogue in this respect, and there has not been much dialogue because, for instance, a conference is not a dialogue most of the time. It's more or less the mere juxtaposition of presentations, and it's not really a dialogue. But having a real dialogue can I think play a role in that, and trying to see where we can go. And I don't know where we can go. I would say that now the situation is, I would say, about the following. There are in the various regions of the world, and especially in the global south, there are more and more voices that are claiming for new ways to practice social science in general.
Okay, Prof.
And I would just add one thing,
okay.
if I may.
Taylor has added that question in the chat box. If you can also respond to that.
Okay, I look at that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So there are more voices in those different regions of the world, but this multiplication of voices is not really paid attention to. So I think that one of the steps we need to move to is precisely to pay more attention to that. So now, okay, there is this question, yes, about what are the chances in internal preferences of African women who would be listened to as a sociologist? I can't really, honestly, I can't answer that, because of course I won't give you a percentage, because it would mean having an idea, for instance, about what kind of academic discipline that is in the university. What kind of discipline is sociology in the university? I will give you one example. In France, sociology is a feminine discipline. In the first year at the university, there are 80% women. But when you grow in the various levels in the university, the number of women decreases. And we could say that in France, if you look at the number of doctorates and the number of doctors in sociology, it's about, well, 60% women, 40% men, something like that. So it's still quite feminine. But it is not because this is the case in France that it is the case in South Africa. Because the history of not only the discipline, but the history of the institutionalization of the discipline in South Africa is certainly different. So we would need to know how feminine or how masculine is sociology, not only in South Africa, but also in such and such university, because then it it would certainly give a form of a ratio, of a scale of how possible or the likeliness to become a sociologist. And then, of course, it's not because you are or because you have become a sociologist, and if you want to become one, just you have my best wishes for that. But once you are a sociologist, it doesn't mean you are listened to. Whether you are an African or a South African woman or a South African man, because then it also depends on the place that such disciplines as the social sciences can play in the public debate. And this is very important as well. And it's not the same in, I don't know, it's not the same in Germany, it's not the same in France, it's not the same in China, it's certainly not the same in South Africa as well. What I'm saying here is that, and I hope that I'm in line with what I've said in my presentation, we need to be specific. That is, I cannot answer for South Africa if I do not know, if I have not studied the social situation of the disciplines and of the public debate in South Africa, which means that the studies are to be historically anchored and socially anchored and to be specific. And then it is possible to try, and I insist on trying, to try to establish comparisons. Thank you for your question.
Okay. Thank you for that, Prof. I would want to give it a small, if I can comment on that, South African sociology.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
And if some people, if some students or colleagues have questions or want to be in touch or whatever, just feel free to give my contacts so they can ask me their questions or give me their comments. I'd be happy to respond.
Thank you very much, Prof. Definitely, we would want to keep.
Thank you so much.
We would like to keep the conversation and also looking forward to the paper. I think it will be quite very helpful for us here especially when we will keep in touch and let's continue the conversation going forward.
Absolutely.
So on behalf of my colleagues here at Sopraki University and on behalf of South African Sociology, thank you very much, Prof, for the very exciting and thought-provoking presentation. We'll be looking more to more engagement and more sort of like, we're looking forward more coming from you and other parts of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for colleagues and students, and thank you, Simbarashe, and thank you, Crispin, as well. And hoping to hear from you soon and to see you soon and keep the conversation going. Thank you so much.
Okay. We'll see you at ISA. Thank you. Goodbye.
Yeah, absolutely. Bye.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.